Last video I looked at ChatGPT, and the question I was asking was, can ChatGPT help you fix your car if you aren't very familiar with cars, maybe don't know how to work on them, and you're just trying to do little maintenance things or work on your car yourself so that you can avoid a large mechanics bill. The ChatGPT for that context had some strengths and it had some limitations. Some of the strengths included that it provided lists of instructions all listed out in a nice sequential order, which is something that you would be harder to find if you used Google or something. Also, it was able to provide some specific facts about a particular car, although sometimes it took a little prompting to get it to actually bring up those facts. Some of the limitations were, a big one was that there was no visuals. You had to describe what you were trying to do, and then the ChatGPT had to describe to you using words what you need to do. And so it would have been a lot better if ChatGPT if you could put visual input into ChatGPT, like take a picture of the thing that you're looking at and put it in, and then ChatGPT could create a picture showing you circle which bolts you need to take out or whatever. Also, ChatGPT did occasionally bring up incorrect information. Mainly when it was doing this, it was because the advice that it was giving was very generic and not specific to the car that I was trying to work on. However, I figured that some of these limitations might be overcome if you are more familiar with cars and know how to work on them. So I was wondering if ChatGPT could be helpful for experienced mechanics. Could this make an experienced mechanic's job easier? So a few years ago, I took my 2008 Pontiac Torrent to a mechanic. The reason I took it to a mechanic was to get the yearly state inspection done, but I also wanted to have them check the transmission fluid. I didn't know how to do that at the time because I couldn't see a transmission fluid dipstick under the hood like on many other cars with an automatic transmission. And looking at the transmission itself, I didn't see a transmission fill level plug like there is on my 2008 Chevy Cobalt. So I brought it into the mechanic and asked them to just check all the fluids. They did that, but then they couldn't find the transmission. They couldn't find how to check the transmission fluid in that particular vehicle. So they called me in, and I looked underneath the car with them, trying to figure out where it is, and I couldn't find it either. They called their boss in, and he couldn't find it either. So finally, I start searching online, searching on YouTube, and I find a video, and it shows me where that transmission fluid dipstick is and how to get to it. So my thought was, now these were all experienced mechanics, but they weren't familiar with the specific location of the transmission fluid dipstick in that car. What if they had ChatGPT? So I went ahead and told ChatGPT that, hey, I'm a mechanic and I've got this car and I'm trying to find the transmission fluid dipstick, but I can't find it. And so it says that it does not have a traditional dipstick, which is true. It has a sealed transmission system, which a lot of the newer cars now have. It's not actually sealed. There has to be a way to put fluid in and take fluid out. It's designed to be serviced by the dealer only and not by anyone else, although a lot of them can still be serviced by other people. And then it provides instructions, but it doesn't describe the transmission fluid dipstick properly. It tells me to look for a bolt on the side of the transmission. First of all, it's not a bolt. Second of all, that's not going to be helpful. So I ask it again, what is the specific location of that plug? And it doesn't tell me. What it should tell me is that you have to remove this front engine mount here, and then you have to unscrew this bolt right here in order to actually access the transmission fluid level dipstick. But ChatGPT was unable to tell me that no matter how much I asked it. I asked it again, I am having trouble locating that part. Can you describe its location in greater detail? And the best that it could tell me was that it was located on the driver's side of the transmission case toward the front of the vehicle, but it never told me that it was hidden behind an engine mount. So I ran ChatGPT through a series of tests, basically different situations that could come up if you were a professional mechanic working on a car and you aren't sure, maybe you need some advice or you need some information, and I was wondering, can ChatGPT help you get that information, solve that problem? So for where is this part, they failed. ChatGPT could not tell me where the transmission fluid level dipstick is on a 2008 Pontiac Torrent, no matter how much I asked it and how hard I tried. ChatGPT just could not get there. So then I decided to ask it a slightly easier question. The transmission fluid level dipstick, that's kind of a part, I'm sure it's in a bunch of dealership technical manuals and stuff, but it's not widely known. However, the location of the battery on a car is something that people need to get to a lot. So there should be a lot of information out there on where the battery is located in a particular car. Now for this one, I used the 2008 Chevy Cobalt. I said, where is the battery located in its 2008 Chevy Cobalt? And it gave me a very generic answer saying it's under the hood in the engine compartment on the driver's side of the vehicle, and then it gives me the steps to locate it and remove it. However, that's just not true. The battery is not under the hood. So, obviously as an experienced mechanic, you know, I can look underneath the engine bay, and even if the battery's hidden in some sort of like battery box or something, I'd be able to see it. So I'm like, there is no battery located in the engine compartment. I've looked in the engine compartment, there is absolutely no battery in there. And that's like, oh, I'm sorry, actually the the battery for the Cobalt is located in the trunk. And then it gives me the steps, open the trunk, lift up the trunk liner, the floor pan, and then the batteries in the trunk, and then, yeah, it gives me the proper instructions then. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a B. It's not quite A material because it didn't give me the right answer the first time. However, it did eventually give me the correct answer, as long as I knew that the first answer, as long as I could figure out that the first answer it gave me was wrong and was able to prompt it again. The next question I went ahead and asked it was about torque specs. So I have a large PDF document, and I've seen these printed out and stuck up on walls, that has all of the wheel lug nut torque specs for all sorts of cars. So whenever you are putting lug nuts on a car, whenever you're putting a tire on a car and putting lug nuts on, you are supposed to set them to a specific measure of torque in foot-pounds. So I went ahead and figured that ChatGPT, instead of me looking up on the table and finding it, can ChatGPT do it faster? So I went ahead and asked it, what are the torque specs for the lug nuts on a 2008 Pontiac Torrent. This time I'm going to give it an A because it was able to give me the correct torque specs for that car so that I was able to find it faster than looking it up on the chart myself, and I was able to get those wheels put on the car a lot faster. Now going back to the Cobalt for a second, the reason I was asking where the battery is because the battery is dead. And I didn't discover that the battery was dead until I took the only key for the car, put it in the ignition, and tried to start it. Now, on a lot of cars, especially cars made after like the 2000s, they have an ignition interlock device. So if the key is in the ignition and the ignition is forward into the on position and power is cut to the car, either the battery is removed or the battery dies, that key is locked inside that ignition until you put power back to the car. It's an anti-theft deterrent, but what it means is, if you go to start your car and you've got a dead battery, you can put the key in and turn it to the on position, it won't crank over, and then the key is stuck in the ignition. So, I opened the hood, and this is something that actually happened to me with that Chevy Cobalt. So, the first thing I do is open the hood and look for the battery so that I can remove the battery, put a new battery in, and start the car. But then I can't find the battery. Eventually, now ChatGPT did help me find the battery a lot faster, but eventually I figured out that the battery was in the trunk. The Chevy Cobalt has an electronic trunk release, which wasn't working because the battery was dead. Well, that's no problem because the trunk still has the manual key in order to open it. However, I only had one copy of the key, and that was stuck in the ignition. Oh, well, you can go in through the back seats because there's normally like a release for the back seats. Nope. In a 2008 Chevy Cobalt, the release to put down the back seats, those release buttons are actually in the trunk. So you open the trunk and there's a little cable that you pull to flop down the back seats. So, I'm in kind of a pickle because I need to change the battery in order to get the key out of the ignition, and I can't get the key out of the ignition until I change the battery. So what do I do now? This took a lot of brainstorming. It took me a few hours to figure out what I could actually do, but I was hoping that ChatGPT would give me ideas on how to get out of this predicament a lot faster. So I said the battery is in the Cobalt is dead, and because of this, the only key is locked in the ignition and the electronic trunk release is not working. What do I do now? And it's like, oh, use the manual key to unlock the trunk. I was like, I don't have a manual key because the only key that I have is inside the ignition. And then it's like, oh, contact a locksmith or a Chevy dealership to obtain a replacement key. I mean, that would work, but that's the more expensive option, and I really would rather not do that. Also, it would take a lot longer to get a replacement key than what I ended up doing to actually get out of this predicament. So, so then it's like, try jump starting the car, and it provides the instructions. However, when it tells me to jump start the car, it tells me to connect the jumper cable to the positive cable to the positive terminal of the battery. Well, I can't get to the battery because it's in the trunk. If I could get to the battery, I'd just replace the battery. So I ask it, how can I jumpstart this car if I cannot get to the battery? So then it brings up the fact that there are jumpstart terminals within the engine bay. And so all you need to do is connect the jumper cables to those jump start terminals, which are then connected to the battery, and you don't even have to actually jump start the car. You just have to have the old battery hooked up to those jumper cables for a while to charge up enough so that you can then remove the key and then open the trunk and then replace the battery. And so that's what I ended up doing. So overall, I'm gonna give it a B minus. It did eventually get me to the correct answer, but it did take a while for it to actually get there, and a lot of it was me having to kind of lead it. So I was like, oh, well, how can I jumpstart the car if I can't get to the battery? And that's when it was like, oh yeah, those battery posts, the jumpstart posts underneath the hood. I don't know, it was probably faster than when I initially had this problem and was trying to figure it out myself, but it still wasn't like an amazing, immediate solution. So then I went ahead and see if ChatGPT could help me troubleshoot a truck that won't start. I have a 1952 Rio M35 with the gasoline engine. It won't start. What should I do? So you might recognize this because this is actually the My Truck Won't Start video that I did about a month ago. So I actually had to go through an entire troubleshooting procedure in order to figure out why my truck wouldn't start, and then eventually get it so that it would start up. So ChatGPT gave me a pretty good list. It was like, check the battery, check the fuel system, check spark plugs, ignition system, mainly like the distributor, check the carburetor, check the timing, check the compression. So that's a pretty good list. Some of it kind of are parts of my list. So when I'm troubleshooting a car, what I always do is go through this list: fuel, air, spark, compression, starter. The spark system includes things like the distributor, the spark plugs, and your plug wires, and things like the timing. The fuel system includes things like the fuel filter, the fuel pump, and then the carburetor is actually where fuel and air combine, if you have watched my carburetors video, which, now that I think about it, might not be out yet. And then compression is another one, and then you also need the starter to be fully functional, and with the starter, actually you need the starter motor itself, which is an electric motor that turns over the engine so that it can actually start. But you also need the battery to supply enough current to turn the starter motor fast enough for the engine to be able to start. So if you've got a battery that's getting kind of low, it might be enough power to power the distributor so that you have spark, but if the battery is starting to get a little low, it might not be able to power the starter motor with enough current. So ChatGPT gave me a list. So now all I have to do is go down and check each thing on the list and then report in what I found. So I say, and this is the first thing I noticed, if you listen to my explanation on the how to troubleshoot a truck that won't start video, the engine, I figured out, the first thing I noticed was the engine turns over slower than it should, and it does not start. And then so I gave it that prompt, and it was able to correctly identify that the starting system might be the problem. So it tells me that it's probably something here. So it tells me to check the battery. It tells me to check the starter. It also tells me to check the charging system. This would be the alternator, or in the case of my truck, the generator, because it might be that the charging system is the reason that the battery doesn't have enough charge. Although for trying to start the truck, the charging system is kind of out of the equation because it's not actually producing enough energy to charge the battery while the truck is trying to start. It's only after the truck has been started and is running that the charging system is actually charging the battery. So that's kind of like the cause of the battery problem, but that is a thing for down the line. Once we actually get the truck started, we can test the charging system and figure out why that battery went bad. Interestingly, it also tells me to check the fuel system. If the engine is turning over slowly, it could also be a fuel system problem. Check the fuel tanks, fuel lines for any blockages or leaks. Try adding fresh fuel to the tank and see if the engine starts. I've never heard of fuel issues causing an engine to turn over slowly. Unless it is, I mean, as long as the starter is spinning at the proper speed, yeah, it won't start if there are fuel issues, but it's not like it would turn over any more slowly because the rate that it's trying to turn over is governed only by the starter. So I thought that was a little odd, but, you know, I also love that I told it that I was a professional mechanic, but it keeps saying, if you're unable to diagnose the problem on your own, it may be best to have a qualified mechanic inspect the vehicle. Okay, so then I went ahead and checked the battery, checked the start. Well, I checked the battery and I found that the battery was low. So I charged it up and I told it, I charged the batteries and it turns over much faster now. When using starting fluid, it starts immediately, then dies out quickly. So now the starter situation is all taken care of because I am providing more current, so the starter is able to turn over a lot more quickly, but it's still not starting. And so that's when you go with one of these other ones, is the cause of it not starting. So fuel, air, spark, or compression. So I told it that I tried using starting fluid, which is compressed ether in a can. Basically, you're providing a fuel with a very low flash point, and it can help the engine start by providing just that little bit of fuel that it needs to touch off and start going. And when I provide that fuel, it starts right up. And it runs, but then it dies quickly. That is usually indicative of a fuel starvation problem. So when you're providing that fuel from the starting fluid, it's fine, it's happy. But the minute you stop providing that fuel, when the fuel from the truck is supposed to take over, it's just not happening. And the fact that it does start up and run, at least for a little bit, tells me that all of the spark stuff is working properly. because if it was out of timing, or if some of the spark plugs or the distributor was bad, it would either run really rough, like it would be constantly misfiring, or it would just not run at all. So it correctly identifies that it is a fuel problem and tells me to check the fuel filter, check the fuel pump, fuel injectors, which my truck does not have fuel injectors, it has a carburetor. Check the air filter, check the spark plugs, check the ignition system. So that is a little weird that it tells me to check the air system, because the air-fuel mixture from the starting fluid is going in through the air intake. So it's probably not an air-related issue. And also, like I just said, if it is starting and actually running, even if it's only running for just a few seconds, it's enough to determine that all of the spark system is firing on all cylinders, everything is happy with the spark system. But it did tell me that it was a fuel problem, and so then I said, there's no fuel getting to the carburetor, but the fuel line going from the carburetor to the sediment bowl is clear, and there is no fuel and there is fuel in the sediment bowl. So you'll have to watch that video with the explanation, but basically I know that fuel is getting to the fuel pump and it's getting to that glass fuel filter just after the fuel pump, but it wasn't getting to the carburetor for some reason. The first thing I thought was, oh, that line is clogged from the fuel pump to the carburetor. So I undo that line and I flush it out, and it's perfectly clear. There is no blockage or buildup or anything in there. So I know that's not the issue. So let's see what ChatGPT thinks the issue is. Check the carburetor float. The float in the carburetor controls fuel level in the carburetor bowl. If the float is stuck or not working, it prevents fuel from getting in the engine. Check carburetor jets, check carburetor gaskets, check carburetor choke, check the fuel pump. Even if there is fuel in the sediment bowl, the fuel pump could still be the problem. Check the fuel pump for any signs of damage or wear. You can use a fuel pressure gauge, check the pressure of the fuel and make sure it's within manufacturer specifications. I don't know why it's so focused on the carburetor. I just told it that fuel is getting to the fuel pump and the sediment bowl, but I told it that fuel is not getting to the carburetor. Now, there may still be an issue with the carburetor, but if fuel's not even getting to the carburetor, then the issue is somewhere before the carburetor. And so the fuel pump, that last suggestion, is the best. And that last suggestion was actually the reason my truck wasn't starting. It had a bad fuel pump. The fuel pump was able to draw the fuel from the tank, but it wasn't producing enough pressure on the output to push the fuel up from where the fuel filter, where the fuel pump is on the side of the engine toward the bottom, all the way up and over to where the carburetor is. So it did eventually correctly tell me that it was a fuel problem, and it was specifically a fuel pump problem. However, it did throw in some weird suggestions here and there, and honestly, I could have done this all myself. ChatGPT might have made it a little faster because I was just able to put in what I was seeing and it was able to think for me. Sometimes in the moment you're struggling to come up with, well, what are the possible causes and which ones can I rule out right now? So ChatGPT might be able to help you be able to rule stuff out and be able to focus on what your what the cause might be, especially if you're having trouble like right in that moment. It's hard sometimes to think of all this when you're just trying to get that truck started. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a B+. I can definitely see how it could be a benefit to be able to bounce ideas off of, and if you are an experienced mechanic or someone who knows a little bit more about cars, you can tell when it is giving you can tell at least pretty quickly when it's giving you good advice versus bad advice. And if it does give you some bad advice, like it's saying that the part is located in this one location, and you look there and you know for a fact that it's not there, you can go back and say, hey, this part is not there, and you can be more confident about it. And then eventually ChatGPT will give you the correct answers. I think the average is a B with this. Yeah, the average rating for ChatGPT for mechanics is a B. It can definitely prove useful in certain situations. It does still have a lot of the same limitations that it did before, mainly the misinformation or the generic information that doesn't apply to your specific vehicle. However, it does have some strength. It is able to help you think through situations in that moment, and you can come to a solution a lot quicker. So that whole diagnosing and troubleshooting on my truck, that was pretty much all day. It took me pretty much all day to go from, oh, this truck is not starting, to figuring out what exactly is wrong and fixing it so that I could get the truck started. ChatGPT definitely could make that process a lot faster. And like I said, with the Cobalt, again, that took me like half a day to figure out how to get the Chevy Cobalt started once I discovered the battery was dead and that I had no way to get to the battery. So overall, we have discovered that ChatGPT, at least in its current iteration, has a very limited use case in automotive repair, in actually working on cars. And that's true whether you are an experienced mechanic or whether you are someone who just wants to start working on their own vehicle. So what is ChatGPT good for? Well, through this process, I ended up using ChatGPT a lot, and I found that it was actually extremely helpful for managing this YouTube channel. The description on this video and my previous video on ChatGPT were almost entirely AI generated. The titles, ChatGPT was able to come up with some title ideas, and then I bounced those ideas off of some friends of mine, and that's when we settled on this one title. So it wasn't completely AI generated, but the AI did provide some inspiration. The AI has also been useful in helping me plan out video ideas. It's been able to craft scripts, it's been able to craft outlines, and it's been able to just give me just straight ideas. So ChatGPT has actually been very useful for the YouTube channel, and yeah, ChatGPT is very useful for some professions. It's just it's not as useful in certain other situations.